Third Degree repeatedly invited lineman executives to appear on this program to give some perspective on the recent strike and also to answer questions around the appalling conditions their workers live in. Analysts have lambasted linemen because many of its workers still live in abject poverty, this 18 years into post-apartheid South Africa. Linemen declined our invitation, citing the recommencement of the Marikana inquiry as the reason for this. So we spoke to CEO of Ashanti Gold, Mark Kutufani. It should be noted that they have a completely different setup to Marikana. Some workers have housing and other benefits, living in far superior circumstances to their lineman colleagues. I began by asking him whether this was the equivalent of the Middle East's Arab Spring.
Well, I think it's certainly more deadly in the most tragic of circumstances, or the most tragic way to look at it, given Marikana. I certainly wouldn't call it a workers' spring insofar as the great tragedy, I think, that will unfold on top of the death toll, which is tragic, is the loss of jobs that will ultimately come from this. So in my view, it's more like a workers' winter, and that's the tragedy of it.
Explain that, the loss of jobs, because that has been the constant refrain here, that bigger increases means even more losses in jobs eventually.
Yeah, and that's my great concern, is that 50%, and I'm going to talk about platinum for a minute, even though I'm from the gold industry, maybe as a chamber member, 50% of the platinum shafts are actually losing cash. So as they agree to higher salaries, for them to be able to balance the books, they're going to have to reduce their numbers. So what that looks like, how many jobs are lost, I'm not quite sure, but it is a real concern, and it's something that is inevitable, unfortunately. And in the gold industry, if we look at increases above and beyond what we agreed last year, there will be job losses. Mining
analysts are saying that mining bosses were looking for an excuse to make these cuts anyway, because the mining industry is so beleaguered.
Look, we're in a tough situation, but I don't think any mining boss would want to see the circumstances that have occurred here and the results in any way, shape or form. Because the one thing you've got to remember is, after this is all over, we've got to get back together and work together. And I think one of the great challenges we're all going to have is, how do we get through this and come back and work together as partners, because we have to be partners in the future, or there is no future.
President Zuma has called for a freeze on executive salaries, that CEOs like yourself and others should take a freeze for 12 months as a gesture.
Yeah, I think what he's trying to get at is, we've got to do something that demonstrates that we care and we're part of the solution. I, for one, had already committed in our organisation to a salary freeze, so I'm there. It's hard when you're trying to compete with other people on a global basis to keep good young South Africans in South Africa, and the one caveat I put on that commitment is, I will not lose a good South African to the US, to Canada, or to any other country. I'll pay what's required to keep in this country, because without that young talent, that leadership talent, we don't have a future. So we've got to balance the issues, but I think the call is a reasonable one, given where we are in terms of inequality and and the messages we're trying to deliver as leaders of the country.
In terms of the, say, for example, executives, okay, executives in companies versus a mine worker, I mean, the disparity is enormous. Is it fair? Let me put that to you. Like, is it fair that there should be this major gap between, you know, the person who has really the worst job actually going underground?
I'm not sure how you define fair, and if I was a worker, I would certainly look at it as being unfair. And having started in the industry as a worker, I would look at what others were earning above me and say, that's a bit unfair. In the market I operate in, for example...
What did you start as?
A miner, literally. Yeah. As a miner, straight out of high school, university part-time, did my degree over 6 years, and then traversed my way through management ranks.
So you know what it's like to go underground?
Yeah, and I'm from a working class background, so I know what those conversations are like. I know what those conversations are like around the dinner table. When, I guess, sitting here, I've seen both sides of the argument. You see wages that are at a much lower level at the operating level. That's because our productivities are lower. Now, we've put a strategy in place where we'll improve our productivities in the next 10 years with new technologies, and then we should be able to continue to pay above inflation as long as we see productivity. So it's explaining that you can't do it in one step. You've got to do it together over time. based on your ability to pay, and that's where we've got to, and that's how we've got to close the gap.
And so we end our program on the mining industry. We're always interested in hearing your view, so you can fax us on 011 880 8883 or email us on thirddegree@etv.co.za. Or you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Until next week then, thanks for joining us.